Good morning and good afternoon, everybody. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this policy dialogue on cost-efficient and sustainable pathways for future power demand in the context of the Powering Past Coal Alliance Summit, which is happening this week. My name is Norbert Görrissen. I'm Deputy Director General in the Ministry for Environment for International Policy here in Germany. Unfortunately, my boss, Director General Carsten Sach, is sick and is not able to participate, so I'm stepping in for him in the last minute, but I hope I can do at least a little bit replacing for him. I'm also welcoming on behalf of our co-hosts, the think tank Carbon Tracker, and we have Katharina Hillenbrand van der Heyen as head of company research, who will provide a global snapshot of current market trends of different energy technologies. And we have Richard Folland, who is the policy and government affairs advisor, and who will take over the panel discussion after and moderates the open discussion in the second half of that event. The session comes really at the right time. I was impressed by the statement of the Secretary General yesterday, and I'm grateful to our panelists for joining us here today. I will introduce the panelists at the beginning of the discussion, and after we have heard from Carbon Tracker on market developments of major energy technologies. Let me start with a few remarks from my end. Three major challenges we see in that context. First of all, the ongoing corona crisis, which have caused and is continuing to cause significant human and economic losses. And while we are working to get out of this crisis, we also need to find answers to stimulate the economic growth and create jobs. And it's our strong belief that future energy policies and technologies can be a motor for this. And in particular, we see a strong role of renewable energies and energy efficiency. Second, the corona crisis has also amplified the need for us to look at the relationship between energy use, environmental pollution, public health, and resilience of all of us, of our societies, and of our economies. And thirdly, more than 110 countries have committed to become climate or carbon neutral by the middle of this century. These long-term goals now need to be translated into sectoral policies, especially in the energy sector. It's our actions during this decade which will determine whether we can achieve the long-term targets or not. And finally, I'd like to share a few news from the German energy transition. As you may know, we have committed to phasing out coal-fired power plants, and at the beginning of this year, we switched off almost 5 gigawatts of coal-fired power plants after successful auctioning, which allowed energy companies to apply for support in a competitive bidding process. And among the winners, and that's really surprising, was a 1.6 gigawatt coal-fired power plant in Moorburg in Hamburg, one of Europe's biggest ports and industrial cities. And it's remarkable because this plant only started its operations in 2015 and was one of the most efficient and modern coal power plants in the world. But still, the energy utility Vattenfall decided that it was better business strategies to convert this plant to a green energy hub and ending a production of electricity from coal for purely economic reasons. And now they're going to focus on producing, storing, and distributing green hydrogen. This example confirms the market trends and investment data we are seeing. Renewables and other sustainable energy technologies are mainstream, are good business, and are becoming cheaper and more viable. In Germany, for instance, renewable energies generated almost 50% of our electricity last year, providing reliable and cheap power to households and industries, and also creating jobs and incomes for communities. Having said this, I would like now to hand over to Katharina to give us her market perspective on different energy technologies, and I'm sure in a much broader, on a much broader view than just looking only at Germany. And after the presentation, we will dive into the panel discussion. So over to you, Katharina.
Thank you very much, Norbert. I shall share my presentation, and it is indeed about markets and economics of coal and other sources of energy. So first of all, perhaps I'm trying to move, yes, a few words about Carbon Tracker. We are an independent financial think tank. We're founded in 2011, and we have a vision which is to secure a global energy market, and we wish to do that by aligning capital markets with climate reality. So really our model is to reach out to investors, because this is at the end of the day where a lot of decisions are made and a lot of money is moved. So our mission is to map a transition and an orderly transition for the fossil fuel industry to stay well within a well below 2 degrees budget. And we look at all of that in a market and capital context. The COVID situation clearly has revealed some of the weaknesses in the energy market structure, and it has shown some trend of which we see there is no return. If we look at 2020, we can see that demand for fossil fuels fell by about 6% on average. And it is quite remarkable when looking at this slide. We can see that oil declined. Clearly there were some transport issues, but very obviously you see the first bar, which is coal, and that declined in excess of 6%, and there is no transport issues related to coal. Conversely, renewables have increased. Demand for renewables has increased by about 1%. So we can see that there is a structural trend at play. At the same time, and Norbert has already alluded to that, there's some real disruption in technology, and that leads to some radical reshaping in energy market. Our analysis shows that we have looked at a number of exemplary technologies, and these 3 examples are really just the most pertinent ones, that there is a massive shift down the cost curve, and it is continuing. And the very big, important and maturing, but also new renewables technologies. We have seen those costs decline anywhere between 60 and 90% over the last decade. And in many cases, now, if not to say most cases, renewables are now a cheaper and cleaner source of energy than fossil fuel alternatives. Obviously, as you can see in these charts, the cost of renewables is very much linked to its deployment, because there are learning effects and economies of scale. And as we see deployment further increase, we can look forward to additional and further reductions in costs. Obviously, and this is a very strong message, policymakers are absolutely instrumental in ensuring renewables growth at least costs, because it's up to them to create appropriate incentives and market structures to create the playing field and the backdrop and stable legal framework so that a low carbon electricity system can be built with the least cost and most modern technology. If we look at some of this in detail, we can see that the economics of coal-fired power are really coming to an end. We are now seeing that new investments in renewables are cheaper in pretty much all major markets as of today when compared to coal. So just to give you some idea, globally, about 70% of coal is now more expensive to run than it would be to build new onshore wind or solar. When we look forward towards 2030, that proportion increases to over 80%, i.e. Over 80% of global coal capacity would be more expensive to run than new wind or solar, and that is quite a big number. If we look at one of the regions that we're particularly interested in, and where there is obviously some consideration of new coal, Southeast Asia, again, coal-fired power could stop making sense as an option of investors very soon, and actually sort of now is already, as it is becoming more risky, and as increasingly the competition from new renewables as a more economic alternative is increasing. So clearly that shows you also that there is a global energy market transformation underway. It has very important implications also for energy security, particularly as you would think for coal importing nations. If you produce your energy domestically with renewable energy sources, you become increasingly independent of imports, and i.e. therefore you increase your domestic energy security. This is a very interesting slide. We have done some detailed analysis, and we do this analysis at boiler level, very bottom up, of every single reactor across our database. And in that database, we cover over 95% of global coal. And our analysis shows that by now, almost half of global capacity is now cash flow negative. And if we look forward already as of 2028 and certainly by 2030, more than half of global coal capacity will be cash flow negative. So that should be a very, very strong signal for both investors, but also for policymakers. And we see that there are some very basic drivers, and they're very, very important for this cash flow negative profile and lack of profitability. First and foremost, it's carbon pricing. We assume an introduction of an ETS in China and rising prices in China. But obviously, ETS pricing happens beyond China. We do assume an increase in the EU ETS price, which further contributes to that. But also beyond that, it's very important to keep in mind the coal fleet is aging, and that leads to reduced efficiency, higher fuel costs, and also higher carbon costs. And besides that, we have a raft of regulations and issues that require air pollution control technologies, notably in Turkey and India, China, but also the EU and the US. I find this extremely telling. What we see, we call this stranded asset risk, and Carbon Tracker has actually coined the word of stranded assets, i.e. where you can no longer generate an economic return, where your asset becomes uneconomic. And this is very much a phenomenon that we are now seeing in coal. And paradoxically, the world is building more, but it is using less coal. As you can see, capacity factors across the world are now rapidly declining, and actually to the opposite of the build rate. And if you look at where we're standing now, we're looking at capacity factors about somewhat between the 50 to 60% ratio, which is clearly way below what these plants are spec'd for. You can see some of them spec'd for 70 to 80 or even above 80% in the early days. So clearly we're looking at just a bit more than half the utilization rate, and any rational investor would not see that as the most efficient use of its money and investment. So what we are very concerned about, and we've done some detailed calculation on this, if governments and investors nevertheless went ahead and try to go forward with about 500 gigawatts worth of coal capacity that's either currently permitted or under construction, we estimate that about 30% of these projects would enter the market unprofitable from day one. So that means you put an asset into the market, you start out an asset that's unprofitable from its first day of operations. And again, 30%, I could say it another 2 more times, but this is a very big number, and a very big number in terms of wasted money for investors and for policymakers, and ultimately also for consumers. You could ask, is natural gas a viable alternative? And unfortunately, the answer really very much is no, according to our numbers. You can see here a very similar picture to coal. We are estimating that most of gas, again, will uncompetitive from the second half of this decade, and certainly by 2030. This is the point, 2030, where we estimate that gas will become uncompetitive with wind and solar, new wind and solar in all major markets. What we can see already, in places like the EU, well before 2030, we can pretty much see all capacity being uncompetitive. Similar deal in Australia. So again, there is a strong temptation, but obviously it is a large risk if you were to decide to go with coal for gas, because the stranded asset issue that I've just alluded to very well exists with gas as well. So in conclusion, coal is increasingly unviable. There is a very meaningful and important risk of stranded assets, huge wastage of money. It's important, particularly if we look at places such as Southeast Asia. There is a large, very important, there's strong energy demand growth, and clearly you need to fill that, and you need to create capacity. If you're looking at forecasts of demand growth, about doubling over the next 20 years, it's very important that you have the right assets, the right infrastructure in place, and yet you do so in a sustainable way, that it becomes a sustainable filling of that demand. New demand and growth is an opportunity to create the right assets in a financially but obviously climate sustainable way to support that growth. So the message very much is, do not go down the wrong road and waste billions in capital costs and miss the Paris goals, but make sure that policy markets support a viable alternative, ensure for continued growth, and build renewables at least cost. Thank you very much.
Excellent, Katharina. Thanks a lot also for the good timing. There was already a request in the chat whether your slides could be shared. I think that would be great if that would be possible. I think you pointed exactly on the points of economic viability of various energy sources. And what we do now is to dive deeper, in particular in 3 countries and in the region, what the problems are. We go to Bangladesh, India, and Vietnam, and we have a representative of the ADB. Let me just introduce the panelists. First, we have Mr. Mohamed Hussein, Director General of the Power Division at the Ministry of Energy of Bangladesh. We then have Ms. Puong Mai. She is Deputy Director of the Office of Electricity and Renewable Energy Authority in Vietnam. We will then have I mixed the order, but you will be number 2. We would like to welcome also Mr. Ashok Kumar. He's Deputy Director General of the Bureau of Energy Efficiency in the Indian Ministry of Power. And last but not least, we will be joined by Dr. Yongping Zai, who is the Chief of the Energy Sector Group at the Asian Development Bank. Initially, we also have hopes to have a representative of Pakistan, Ms. Nahi Durrani, but she was unfortunately not able to join because of a last-minute commitment in the Pakistani parliament, and parliament always goes first, as you know. Let me start the discussion with a more general question to give our audience a broader overview. So I would like to invite each of you, of the 4 panelists, to give us a brief 1 or 2 minute picture of what the current situation in the energy system of your country is, and how you plan to meet the future power demand. Let me start with as announced, with Mr. Hussein from Bangladesh. Your government is currently preparing the next power system master plan. What is the current status of it, and what is the biggest change compared to the previous power plan from 2016? Over to you, Mr. Hussein.
Thank you, Mr. Norbert, and thanks to the organizers for arranging this excellent policy dialogue. And it's my pleasure to be here with very distinguished co-panelists, along with Ms. Katharina, just presented a very nice presentation on economics of coal. So at the very outset, as you have advised, let me give you a very brief scenario of Bangladesh power sector. We are now having installed generation capacity of 24,500 megawatt, including our captive generators, and the grid capacity is around 21,000 megawatt, where the contribution of natural gas is 54%, including the domestic and imported LNG, followed by some liquid, both the furnace oil and the diesel is 25%. We have a coal of around 2% and hydro of around 1.5%. And there are renewables of altogether grid and off-grid is 3%, and grid is around 1%. So with this, you see, we consider the power master plan as a living document, depending on our demand as well as the fuel availability, fuel mix. And we prepare and update it in a routine way, particularly after 5 years interval. And we have prepared our master plan last in 2016. Before that, it was prepared in 2010, where we have catered 50% from the coal by the year 2041. While we revised it in 2016, we have reduced this plan where coal contribution would be around 35%. So you can understand that depending on the economics, on the climate vulnerability, global concern, we are revising our master plan, and with a special emphasis on the reduction of the coal. We are now reviewing our master plan. In fact, is not yet going on. We are preparing for revising it, and we believe that this will further be reviewed. As you know that though we have started our coal, inclusion of a coal, considering that it would be a least cost option, but under, as Ms. Katharina was also explaining, is we found that is no more a least cost option besides other implications. So hopefully there will be some reflections in our coming master plan. I think I should stop here, then we'll have a chance to talk more.
Thank you, Mr. Hussein. So we heard that your government is going to scrap a number of power plants, and that was announced only recently. Could you perhaps a little bit explain that? I understand that is from various energy sources, but perhaps you can a little bit elaborate a little bit further in what direction the energy policy possibly will evolve in Bangladesh, what you can see as possible ways forward. So I understand that the discussion about the policy is ongoing, and there's no firm decision made yet, but perhaps you can share a little bit the discussion and the various arguments.
Thank you very much. I think already I have indicated in my just earlier deliberations that we have already reduced the plan from 50% to 35% now, as you were telling that further reduction is predicted in our next master plan, due to the fact that we have considered coal-based power plants from our domestic coal as well as imported coal. But our Honorable Prime Minister has given priority to our food security, where our domestic coal mines are situated in a very irrigable agricultural areas. So we have decided not to, in fact, extract the coal domestic coal at the moment. Now, rest is with the imported coal. As I have already told that when we have initially thought back in 2009, we considered that it would be the least cost one, but coal transportation, coal handling, and also land requirement for coal-based power plants do not make it viable. Even at the present, when world LNG market is even more competitive, so we consider that we can discard some of the coal-based power plants to address our commitment. As you know that we are the signatory of Paris Agreement, as well as due to our strong presence in COP, our Honorable Prime Minister is the chairperson of Climate Vulnerable Forum. So we are very much committed to this zero carbon world. That's why we have decided to make our best effort to reduce this plan from the coal. Though at the moment, as I told you, that it is around 2% of our total generation mix. It's only the least. We'll add also very, you can say, the minimal part if it is indispensable. Otherwise, we'll go for alternative fuels. One thing only, as Ms. Catherine was presenting, that the renewable is cheaper than even natural gas and others. If we consider the storage, then how does it come? I would also like to know about it. And also the consideration of the, if not the storage is there, what about the nighttime generation? So I think with this, okay, I can look forward for other questions.
So, thank you, Mohamed, for your complimentary remarks. That's indeed very important and very helpful. And what I can share is, since that's similar also for Germany, phasing out coal has to be discussed in a different way in countries where coal mining is also taking place compared to others. But I think the challenge has an additional dimension there. But thanks for making those points, and I'm sure that in the discussion we come back, in particular, to your questions regarding storage and the lifetime generation of renewable energy production, because there's a lot of information available, and I'm sure our experts will come back to that. But I would like to go on now with our next panelist, with Mr. Ashok Kumar. Could you perhaps share with us what are the current trends in the Indian power sector in terms of policies and markets? Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Garrison, and thank Catherine for the presentation, and good morning to distinguished panelists there, and good afternoon to the panelists from the eastern part of the world. So thank you for the opportunity. And from Indian perspective, we have, I think you all know that we have a large share of electricity that comes from thermal-based or the fossil fuel-based resources. So currently we have a total installed capacity of around 377 gigawatts, out of which around 220 or so, around 61 to 62% comes from coal and gas or diesel and all the fossil fuel based. And we have about 36% coming from renewable energy, including the large hydro. And if we exclude the large hydro, it is around, so from solar, wind, bio, it comes around 25%. So this is broadly, we have 3-4% of electricity coming from nuclear. So that is the broad portfolio of energy that, the power that comes from to India. So we have, realizing that the larger goals of Paris and the global climate commitments, country has taken several steps. We are into process of retiring old and inefficient plants, and quite substantial capacity has already been retired, and few are still in process of retiring. So that is one concrete step that we are taking, which are have high heat rate or consuming a lot of energy. So we are retiring them. And then we have also, since India has taken a, you can say, a policy decision since 2017 that any new power plant that would commission after 2017 should come from supercritical technology. So then there won't be any subcritical technology-based power plants that could be commissioned. And along with that, many of you might know that India has a very robust energy efficiency program for industrial sector, which includes thermal power plants also, which is mandatory under a statute. So which requires them to improve efficiency over a period of time. So we have included thermal power plant sector, and we are almost including around 85 to 90% of the power plant, the coal-based power plant fleet. So we are working on that. So we are kind of improving the efficiency and kind of doing the greening of that portion. There is a also we are into we have this renewable energy purchase obligations for any power producers to kind of take burden of having renewables proportionate to the electricity that they produce. And moreover, that is where we are, and we have other measures to, and the big aspect, and also probably all of you know that India has a very exponential growth or a plan for installation of renewables. By 2020, we want to increase it to 175 gigawatt, and by 2030, we will ramp up to 450 gigawatts. So, so that would, to a large extent, will have a big tilt towards the renewables share. So portfolio-wise, I think these are the major, areas that I would like to highlight here. So that's where I think my initial intervention. So thank you.
Thank you, Ashok. May I also ask a second question to you? We understand that there is the 8th Power Development Plan in the making in India, and I would like to ask you, what role does the substitution of energy sources, particularly with respect to replacing coal, play in that plan, and what are the drivers for that? Perhaps you can elaborate a little bit on that. And I would also park the question of supercritical power plants as something which perhaps could be picked up in the panel discussions thereafter. Over to you, Ashok.
Yeah, could you please repeat the question, because I think some connection issue, couldn't get clearly.
Sorry, I was mixing it up also with the conclusion. So we understand that in India, the Power Development Plan 8, the 8th part of London is under preparation. And we would like to understand, or I would like to understand, what role the substitution of energy sources, in particular the substitution of coal, in this Power Development Plan is relevant. What are the plans there? What are the drivers for that? Can you elaborate on that?
I'm not yet clear which power development plan are you talking about?
Very sorry, I'm mixing it up with Vietnam. That was the question to Mrs. Mai. I'm very sorry for that. So sorry for that. I was confusing you and everybody here. Sorry for that. Let me then perhaps get back to you and asking you to elaborate a little bit further on your renewable energy targets, which you already have mentioned. You wanted to achieve 450 gigawatt by 2030, and you mentioned already energy efficiency. What is your view? What role would conventional energy sources play then in 2030 when renewable energies are growing in this dramatic exponential way, as you have already outlined? And sorry again for mixing it up. That is, and Mrs. Mai, you know what question would come to you. Over to you, Ashok.
No problem. On the renewables, as we have a very robust program for particularly in the solar space, and I would say that one of the cheapest price that has been discovered in India, we have, I don't know how it would convert it to euro or dollar, but we have around less than 1.5 rupee. So that is very cheap. So that pricing will drive us, and that pricing gives us the hope that the ambitious target that we have put in place, that would be realized. And also the analysis from Catherine also gives the indication that there would be huge benefit and the way to go in the renewable side. However, India also has a large share of the coal-based power plants, and there would be substantial presence of them in the 2030 timeline. However, those would be their contribution. For instance, we have been working with the German agency GIZ to work on the flexibilization of backing down build the capacity of a base load coal-based power plant to run at loads which are far below what is supposed to be running at. So there is so for example, in the presentation, we have seen that PLF is now drawing closer to 55%. So we in India, we are experimenting even below 50% to examine that these plants can be running at below 50% PLF to accommodate the share of renewables, so that the whole mix of the power becomes more and more green. So of course, we are looking at increasing of the share of solar renewables to one hand, and at the same time, we are also somewhat giving way to them from the coal-based power plants, and gradually the share would be on the renewable side, and the coal-based share would be decreasing. That is what is expected in the times to come. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this answer, and thanks also for mentioning the bilateral collaboration we have with you, and we will certainly continue to discuss that with it and work with you in order to decrease the share of conventional fossil energy sources in the future. Now I hand over to Tuan Mai. You actually have heard already my follow-up question, but first please start with presenting the current status of the power sector in Vietnam, and what are your plans for meeting future power demands, and then perhaps you can also already directly elaborate a little bit on your power development plan 8 and to what extent substitution of energy sources plays a role there. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me well? Yes. Firstly, I'd like to send my greeting to everyone because this is my great pleasure to join with our meeting today. So firstly, I would like to share briefly about the power sector in Vietnam. This is the data collected by end of 2020. So I would introduce a little bit about the power mix in Vietnam. By end of 2020, the total installed capacities of the system is 69,300 megawatts. And the power mix would include 31% from coal, 30.3% from hydropower, 10.3% from gas, and 25.3% from renewables, 2.2% from oil, and a small part is we import from outside is less than 1%. So with this power mix, you can see there's nearly 1/3 is shared by coal power plants. And for the future plans, we are developing the power development plans number 8, we call PPCA, which is to be submitted to get the approval by end of March. So now we are at the last round of getting the from relevant ministry and authorities. And by the second part of March, we will submit to the governments and get the approval. For the power resource development plans, there's 11 stipulated scenario was analyzed. However, there's only one to be picked up. And either any one scenario to be chosen, it would be fulfill some of the following criteria. Firstly, is to ensure the power securities, because you may know that the power demands in Vietnam is keep increasing. If we don't mention about the COVID-19 situations, then the increase rate is about 9 to 10% per year. Still there's a great demand. It's coming to make a big challenge to us. The second criteria that the PDP, the scenario of the PDP should meet is to respond to Vietnam commitments with the international communities in reducing environment pollutions from the power generations. That is we already commit and we try to fulfill this commitment. And the third one is the cost for the power production. It's low, but should harmonize the interests between the public sector, the investor, and the end user, because that would bring to the sustainable power supply in the long term. Besides that, for the grid developments, since we are facing some challenge in the grid developments, because in the last 3 years, the big share of the renewable integrate into the grid. Suddenly, that the grid system is not developed fast enough to accommodate for all the renewable produced from the new farm, wind farm and solar farm. That is why the grid developments should ensure the safe and continuous transmissions from all the power plants. And we also plan for the smart grid and 4.0 integrated grid. All those things has been proposed in the PDP number 8. That is the generous for the PDP 8. Of course, we will have the official announcement after the PDP number 8 to be approved by the government. I think hopefully by end of March or early of April this year.
Thank you. We are very much looking forward to that plan and to the discussions, to the decisions of the government about that. I would really ask you, perhaps you can already share a few views. What would you see as the most important areas where international collaboration can help you in advancing such a PDP as much as possible to be aligned with the Paris Agreement and strict emission reduction pathway? Perhaps you can say a few words on that, and I hand over to you.
Yes. Actually, in the PDP number 8, I think we will reflect the energy transitions policies in the PDP number 8. The first, the physical one, you can see that is we would reduce the capacity of coal power, because in 2020, the coal power share in the power mix, I just mentioned, is 31.1%. And we have planned to reduce to 18% in 2045. Answer to your previous questions, how we replace the share of the coal is we would increase the portion of renewable energies, which is especially focused on wind and solar power and small hydro power. For the big hydro, we have no more capacity, no more potential to develop, but the small hydro, there's still some potential, so we try to explore that. And at the same time, we will increase the use of LNG up to 50% in 2045. But there's another challenge if we increase the LNGs, because we need to import the LNG from outside. So that is also the challenge that we need to consider in the future power mix. As I mentioned earlier, that at the same time, we need to resolve the issues of the grid transmissions of the renewable energies. Due to the high concentrations of wind and solar power plants are mostly at the center and the south part of Vietnam, that it would cause the very heavy burden for the transmission lines in that area, that we need to build more grid line in the area to evacuate the power. At the same time, to develop LNG or any new type of resource, we need to have the reliable policy, and also at the same time we need to have enough legal framework to develop, because that is important for the investor, especially the foreign investor, if they come to develop in Vietnam. So we need firstly to revise the electricity law. And I think some of the investment law or PPP law also need to review and adjust if needed. That is very important if we want to attract the investment from outside. So in this regard, I think the international corporations with more developed or more experienced country would be very helpful to us. And the second point that we expect to have more collaborations with international, it's the to support us in dealing with the technical issues when we have the bigger share of the renewable on the system, because the renewable resource normally would cause the unstable, and as we know that the price of the renewable is declining. However, if we also incorporate the part of storage. At the moment, I think the price is not really cheap. That is one of the considerations that we need to consider when we try to promote for the renewable. Because, for example, for the renewable PPA, we normally it will last for the 20 years for the PPA. And with that term, it's very hard for us to focus what would happen after 20 years. And now, the price is getting declined, but the new technologies will come. And normally, the new technologies may not bring the price lower. Maybe yes, maybe no, because we do not know that far future what would be happen. That is why the trend is decline, but we need to also consider the transmissions, the stable of the system, and how to control the system. I think that all bring the cost to the end user. That is, in this regard, we need to have to share the experience, or we need to get the opinion or consultants from the international organizations or partner to help us to analyze and give us the comments how to organize and better manage the power system with the high share of renewable. That is, I think, some point. Of course, there's some other aspect that we can have further discussion. But firstly, I just mentioned that some.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for those points, and I think it's coming through very clearly from all of the three country representatives that there are some common lines which should need further discussion and also further assistance, and storage is one of them, and the integration of renewable energies in the grids is another area. I think the question of LNG is a third area which I identified here, which is also relevant in Bangladesh. So perhaps, Richard, that could be some of the points you may pick up in the panel discussion. But before we come to you, Richard, we need to listen to our last panelist, which is Yongping Zhai from the Asian Development Bank. So the Asian Development Bank has a huge portfolio of diverse projects in the energy field all over the continent. We would like to hear from you what are your priorities at the moment. We also noticed that the ADB has actually not longer financed coal power projects since a number of years, but it's not yet written in a clear policy. And I think we're also missing not only from the ADB, from the MDBs in general, a clear roadmap towards aligning of towards the Paris Agreement. Perhaps you can share a few points on those elements, but of course with a clear focus on energy. Over to you, Yongping Tsai.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gaurisan, for chairing this discussion. I'm happy to be part of this panel, particularly after hearing from officers, colleagues from our member countries. I am more convinced that the ADB should be providing better service to support our member countries. So when you talk about the priorities for our operations, I would say our priorities should reflect the request and the need of our member countries, as the three panelists have just mentioned. In terms of our portfolio, last year in 2020, it was an exceptional difficult year, but our energy sector investment has increased by 60%, reaching to $4.2 billion. I'm kind of relieved to see that countries' governments remain very focused on infrastructure and power sector investment, because power is so crucial. At the time of pandemic, this would help us to maintain all these virtual meetings and all the activities. Energy has to be there. So our lending has increased to $4.2 billion, of which among this $4.2 billion, $2.3 billion were devoted to renewable energy and energy efficiency. The other half, let's say less than half, mostly invested in transmission and distribution. Dan mentioned many times that importance of having a reliable, I would say, add a strong and smart grid that can handle increasing share of renewable energy in the future. As we have learned in 2 weeks ago, then the Texas blackout, part of the problem was lack of reliable transmission and lack of interconnected system with the rest of the country. So it's very important that when we develop renewable energy, we should develop in parallel transmission and distribution, and making this power network more smart and strong, reliable. So this you will see the similar pattern if you look at our portfolio. Looking forward, the pipeline will remain similar, like 45% in renewable energy and 45% in distribution and transmission and distribution. This will be our overall structure of our lending in the coming years. In particular, when the private sector, the renewable energy has become so cheap, as been presented by Ms. Katerina earlier. If the renewable energy has become so mature and competitive, the private sector and commercial banks will take over the lead role in financing these generation assets from supply side, and multilateral and public financiers should do even more work in supporting the public utilities, in particularly transmission and distribution. That's my view on the way to support this transition in Asia. I think it will be similar in the rest of the world. So that's first part of my answer to your question. Second part, you have rightly mentioned that the ADB has not financed any coal. Actually, since 2013, when last time we financed a supercritical coal-fired power plant in Pakistan. Since last, let's say, 8 years, we have not financed any coal-fired power plant. If I can explain this, I think there is, of course, policy dimension of our member countries that they focus more and more on renewable energy and energy efficiency, and they believe ADB will be a strong partner in supporting their renewable energy development. So the policy priorities from government is the first factor. The second factor is that there is a question of economic. Again, I refer to the presentation by Carbon Tracker earlier, that if the coal doesn't make sense for investor, why investor would do it? So I think even as you said that our policy has not been updated, but in practice, if we see that coal asset will become stranded or even already stranded, no financier, ADB as like any financier would not to do that investment. In addition, I have to mention that ADB adopt internally a shadow carbon price of $37 per ton. And if we apply this $37, I don't think any coal power plant, would pass the screening criteria for investment committee in practice. So that's basically explain why ADB has, not supported any coal. I think that said, there is a need. I agree with you that there is a need to look at the text of the policy itself. Our current so-called prevailing policy dated 2009, that's 11 years old. The policy does not reflect adequately the current world in terms of the cost of renewable, in cost of technology progress. I think that also the global commitment in moving toward carbon neutrality and Paris, under the Paris Agreement, there's a target of less than 2 degrees. So complying with this global commitment, there's also a need for us to look at our policies. So reasons for change our policy, update our policy because of technology changes, because renewable energy become competitive, and the global commitment. Our plan is to update this policy by end of this year. So maybe I can stop for now, and then we can have another round of interaction.
Thank you very much for that. That was very crystal clear and crisp, and we're looking forward to that update. Without further ado, I would now hand over to Richard to take the last 15 minutes to also open up the discussion also for other participants and come in with their views, and perhaps bringing in the 4 distinguished panelists again. Thanks a lot for your contributions. Thanks a lot for your valuable contribution. And I think we see the agenda very clearly ahead of us. A lot of work. We're looking forward to working with you. Over to you, Richard.
Norbert, thanks very much indeed. And good morning to you from the UK, or afternoon or evening perhaps in the Middle East or Asia, and I guess if you're in the Americas, I admire your stamina for tuning in. But thanks very much to Katerina for her presentation, for those excellent contributions from our panelists. And as Norbert said, we've got about 15 minutes for an open discussion and questions. We might be able to go over a few more minutes, I think. And I've had some questions come through on the chat, but before that, I wanted to invite, we've got some excellent participants here in the session, to invite anybody if they'd like to ask a question or make a comment based on what they've heard. So if you would like to make an oral intervention now, maybe could I ask if you could switch on your screen and raise your hand, or you can put something in the chat as well if you'd like to ask a question. So am I seeing Thomas wanting from the Danish Climate Ambassador? Am I seeing Thomas, you wanting to come in? Yeah, if so, Thomas, would you like to make your intervention, please? Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. And thank you to Norbert and everyone for this very interesting session. I'm just wondering if colleagues could comment on how we could improve collaboration within, say, use the ADB board as a space also to coordinate on the donor side our actions, if you see any scope for that. All of us who now have zero net targets for 2050 nationally could reflect that in our approach and collaboration with you in the ADB, but also at country level. So that's one question. But then secondly, also to the countries, if you if you see a perspective for a bigger engagement in country in working on this integration of the just transition of the workers and the phase out of coal, given the economics of the coal situation, so that at least the stranded asset I mentioned doesn't reflect negatively on the workers and their transition. Denmark is spearheading now a commission under the IEA on just transition with our Minister for Climate and Energy and the Danish Prime Minister as a patron, and they will look at that whole just transition dimension with a view for coming up with recommendations by the time of the COP. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you, Thomas. I've got a couple more hands raised, but as you've raised a couple of questions there for Mr. Jai of the ADB and then of the country panelists, maybe Mr. Jai, if I could ask you first to address the question, then to ask each of the country panelists if they'd like to respond as well to Thomas. Thank you.
Right. Very briefly, I think ADB as part of the development partners will have close coordination with many of our partners. Myself, a member of the ETC under COP26 Energy Transition Council. So we coordinate our activities, and we are looking for Asian, again, our member countries, what their requirement in this transition. I think this is a key question. For us, even from today's discussion, I see, my view is on this. This transition will take 3 steps. The first step is the decreasing the energy and carbon emission intensity. That's the first quick step by energy efficiency. By all means, we have to do that quickly. And the second step, we have to be clear when this whole growth story of growing emission should stop. So we should find a peak time as early as possible. If we have this year in mind, then we'll be able to plan this whole process easier. Of course, we know the end of this path is carbon neutrality. Even countries have not made that public announcement, but it's clear that we are all part of the Paris Agreement, that and this goal is there. So I think if we know these 3 phases, ADB wanted to support our countries in each of these phases. What are the suitable technologies that should be supported? In the first phase, energy efficiency by all means. Of course, renewable energy should be in now, and also funding viable technology solutions to phase out coal. And that's including energy storage. And very, very long term, I wanted to mention the role of carbon capture and storage. There may not be necessary consensus on that, but I believe that if we want to have carbon neutrality, net zero emissions, that technology has to be considered very long term. So we just published yesterday, by the way, the compendium of carbon capture and storage technology. So I want to say that ADB support our country's requirement. Thank you. In this transition.
Thank you. Very, very helpful answer. I'm going to turn
quick reaction, Richard, before going to the country level. Yeah. I think the UN Secretary General was very clear in his intervention at the plenary yesterday, when he said that the science tells us and the IPCC tells us that basically for us to be on track for Paris, the OECD countries need to phase out coal by 2030 and the rest of the world by 2040. So, Mr. Jai, I mean, you have the science there. There's no need to discuss it. It's on the table from the UN. Thanks.
Okay, yeah, no, good point. Thank you, Thomas. So could I turn each in turn to Mr. Hussain, first of all, from Bangladesh, planning for the transition. Could you make your comments, response quite brief, please, as we've got a couple more questions which I'd like to squeeze in. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. In fact, I'll go quickly. Definitely, you know that we have a transition plan where we will be reflecting in our incoming PSMP, where definitely there will be drastic reduction of our coal and renewables. We have, you know, that we have a commitment of including 10% of our generation mix from the renewables, while it is only around 3%. So, so solar will be in fact dominating from the renewable sources, and we have explored alternative ways of adding the renewables in spite of having our land constraint. We have considered the rooftops and also solar irrigations and other issues. We have also explored the wind. Wind mapping has been conducted, so I believe that we are hoping there will be some renewable for the mix in the generation. And in order to fulfill this commitment, we are implementing the NDC. That we have a plan and we are updating this NDC. We are monitoring seriously the NDC targets, and I think through this we will be able to fulfill our commitment. Thank you.
Thank you. And just anything you would say on what the UN Secretary General said yesterday, phasing out coal in non-OECD countries by 2040?
We are in the process of phasing out, as discussed in the very outset. So definitely this is going on. So our PSMP 2021 will say when will we able to phase out this coal fully. So the moment that this study will be completed, then we can say specifically the target date. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hussain. Could I turn to Mr. Kumar from India now? Same question really about planning for the transition. Anything you'd like to say on that, please?
Thank you, Richard. And from India's side, India is perhaps, as the reports say, that India is one of the major economies so far on track to meet the Paris Agreement. So India has already taken, and it is taking several steps, right from efficiency to other heavy investment and also renewables. So we are on the track to, and also we have already reached halfway, even rather we are more than halfway from the emission intensity target of 33 to 35%. We have already reached cross over 21%. So the actions are, we are taking all the measures that are supposed to be, and in the transition also, we have recently started a big push to electrify the transportation. And we are also, the Honorable Prime Minister has already launched a mission on hydrogen that also particularly focusing on the green hydrogen. So the several steps possible within the limitations of the country, particularly limiting the constraint on the sides of usage and requirement for development of the large population to provide decent amount of energy availability that would require the coal fleet to sustain for some time. So, but however, the other measures to meet the larger climate goal, country is on the track, and we are meeting all the commitments that so far we have made. So, and several of the initiatives, as panelists have identified, those are being implemented right from the, we have touched upon particularly on the efficiency side in all sectors, including buildings, appliances, transport, industry, power plants. Yeah. So we have taken several steps. So we are in the track to the energy transition. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kumar. Could I then turn to Phung Mai from Vietnam? Any comments you'd like to make again on this key question of planning for the transition?
Thank you for the questions. As I introduced earlier, that we are in the transition stage now. In the new PDP8, we have no more coal, the new coal power plant, there's no more, except the power already constructed or under construction right now, because that is belongs to the previous stage of the developments. And we are trying to increase the share of the renewable. So far, the share is more than 20%, I think 25% until now. And if we also include the hydropower, as a renewable one, then the share of the renewable in Vietnam is more than 50% now. And we keep trying that trend to develop in the future. We would promote for the solar and wind, including the offshore wind, because Vietnam have potentials for different type of the renewable. That is why we try to explore all that potential to put in the energy transitions in the near and far future. And I also I am interested in the questions from Thomas about the employee who work in the coal mine previously, and how about their future if the coal will be phased out. Actually, I need to update some information that Vietnam used to be the coal export countries, but we need to start to import coal for the power plant since 2017. I mean, 3 or 4 years ago, and still we consider the carbon emissions would cause the environment's impact. That is why we are considered to replace coal by other type of the energy resources, including the renewable and LNG. Yeah. And for the employee who used to work in the coal mine, I think the old generation, that is many people work in the coal mine, but recently, because the young generations, they are very flexible and active. When they see the trends of the coal is not to have the future, so in early time, they try not to involve in that hard work, and they change their career from the universities and start to change the futures without relying on the coal mine.
Thank you. I'm going to have to bring you to an end there because we've got a few more minutes and there's a couple of people patiently been waiting to ask their questions, but very, very helpful because you've started to go into the just transition here. And there is another session which is going to be exploring that further during the summit, but thank you for raising that point. So we have Emily from Meridian Economics and Mr. Bhaskar from Climate Investment Funds. Your arms must be aching a bit. Could I ask you, Emily, would you like to ask your question first, please? And then I'll ask Mr. Bhaskar as well, and I think those will be all our questions. Over to you, Emily.
So thank you very much, Norbert and Richard, and to the panelists for a really rich session. I've got two questions, if I may. The first one is to Mr. Jai of the ADB. And noting that Thomas has raised the issue of the workers in the just transition, an additional facet of transition that we see very acutely in South Africa is that of our monopolistic utility needing to continue to run its coal fleet, but under a phasing down trajectory whilst the renewables are built. We can't switch overnight, obviously, to a renewable dominated system. And the divestment movement poses many problems for this because moving away from the existing financing of coal puts the utility at risk to be able to manage this transition well. Just to pick up again on what another aspect of what the UN Secretary General said yesterday, called for developing countries to announce the end of international finance to coal. I just wanted to know within the development of the new policy by the ADB, whether they'll be picking up on this issue of what to do about existing investment in coal and how to manage this. Oh, right. My next very brief question is just picking up on emerging research that shows for the rest of the economy to get to net zero, the electricity sector is needing to increase its capacity by between 2 to 3 times to power industry and to provide decarbonized electricity to industry. Just wondered from your panelists if anyone is incorporating this aspect of net zero into their electricity planning. Thank you.
Very, very good open question. Thank you very much indeed. So well, we'll come to the panelists in a moment. Just hold those questions. Mr. Bhaskar, if you'd like to switch on your video. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard, and thank you, Norbert, for excellent moderation. It doesn't look like you are stepping in. Thank you to the panelists for your very interesting interventions. I have a very quick question regarding on the topic of stranded assets. I was wondering what are some of the approaches or pilots that are being considered at country level for the purposes of repurposing existing coal assets as a way to handle the stranded asset issue. And perhaps, I think Mr. Hussain alluded to the use of existing coal mines for the purposes of, or as irrigable lands to address food security issues. But I was wondering if there were other pilots or approaches that will be considered. And this question may be perhaps more for Mr. Kumar from India or Mr. Hussain from Bangladesh. Thank you, Richard.
Okay, super, thank you. We're just about out of time. So, Mr. Jai, if you'd like to take the question there about just transition and financing with a quick answer, and then I'll turn to Mr. Hussain around pilots there, and Mr. Kumar, and perhaps then Phuong Mai from Vietnam on planning, including net zero. Are you doing that? So, Mr. Jai, over to you, please.
Thank you very much for the question. Very briefly, we are currently in the process of having intensive stakeholder consultation, getting views and feedback on our new policy. And this question are actually part of discussion since these months and in coming weeks before we finalize and revise and updating our policy. We will make us, I've of course read the United Nations Secretary General's statement. I know that, take note of what science say, and the new policy would definitely reflect the consensus, the global commitment and global consensus on that in regarding coal. But in terms of existing coal, that there are two dimensions. One is, you know, what ADB itself we have invested, that's very few. Actually, there's not that much of ADB invested, but there are large, you know, a share of Asia represents 70% of the world coal power, and their average age is 12%. So phasing out coal in Asia involves actually more challenges, and ADB should be there not only as a financer, but also as a knowledge partner that's supporting our countries to see what are the practical options to move away from coal. I think that in that regard, that our policy would also define ADB as a knowledge bank and supporting our countries and finding solutions, including this just transition is a very difficult one in Asia for coal. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jai. So, Mr. Hussain or Mr. Kumar, would you like to take on Mr. Bashkar's question about pilot projects in your country? Mr. Hussain?
Thank you, Mr. Abhishek. As I told that we have no plan for our existing coal mines to explore any coal from the existing mines. So I think we have no intention even to go for any pilot project for any diversified use of this coal. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Kumar, anything you would like to add, or also perhaps on this question about net zero as well?
Thank you for the question. From India's perspective, as I was kind of indicating in the earlier remarks, that India is looking for the efficient and effective utilization of the assets that we have. And as Mr. Jai has also mentioned, that this is the area where we have a lot of coal-based power plants. So currently, focus is on the assets that we will be using at most efficiently, so that we have the obligation to provide affordable electricity to many of our population. So given that kind of, and also the aspiring levels of development, so those assets would be used usefully. Possibly the study or indication may have to certainly contextually understood. And so for that, any asset for the monetization or quantification in that direction is currently not contemplated. And also on the Richard's question on the timing of a neutrality point is also countries currently taking all the steps to meet the commitments that is required to as the intensity reduction, as well as meeting other climate or the other commitments that the country has given. So as this time for such transition necessitates, then possibly the country would contemplate and decide on those positions.
Very good.
Thank you.
Thank you for your answer. So Fyung-Ma, you have the final word as a panelist. Would you like to pick up on this question about net zero?
Thank you very much. I'd like to share a little bit that in the PDP number 8, we have the plan to reduce the share of coal, but toward the net zero target, I think it's in the short term, it's quite difficult for Vietnam to state, because you know that we are facing the challenge to ensure the affordable electricity or power for the countries with the rather big populations. And at the same time, we need to fulfill the commitments on the environment protection. So I think we may not get the net zero and the affordable power at the same time, but we have the roadmap to increase the share of the renewables and other clean energies in the power mix to move toward to the cleaner environments, especially for the power sector. So I think that it's too early to mention about the net zero target for Vietnam, but we are moving to that in the future.
Thank you very much indeed for addressing that. So we are out of time. I'd love to continue the discussion, but we'd get a telling off from the organisers, I'm afraid. There were some themes which we didn't have the opportunity really to explore, but maybe which did come out in the earlier panel discussion, Norbert, around storage, questions over the stability of power systems when you're introducing more renewables into it, but also, Katerina, I think a sense that your core message about the risk of stranding of assets seemed to be as well, if one's looking at the financial side. So a very big thank you to everybody who presented and were on the panel, and to the German government and Carbon Tracker for organising this. Norbert, anything you would like to say by way of conclusion?
No, I also would say thank you very much. Very rich discussion, and I think it's very clear and obvious that we need more time to really go deeper in all those subjects. I would just add the point of gas to it. It was in Katerina's intervention, and some of that is also an open question: how we deal with gas in the long run when we talk about net zero.
We would need a separate session for that, wouldn't we?
Exactly. So thanks a lot, Richard, also for your moderation.
Well, thank you. Okay, everybody, have a good day and enjoy the rest of the summit.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.